government for what would happen when the Shah fell, and try to manipulate would be too strong a word, but try to encourage the moderate liberal elements, the Yazdis and those sorts of individuals who may not be necessarily pro-American, but were either pro-democracy or certainly not either Islamists or else or else Marxist, of which there was a considerable number of. So that was Sullivan's view.
We went by the next morning to talk with Sullivan, who was the U.S. ambassador, and I'd known Sullivan before. I'd gone to Vietnam during the bombing of the North, and for some reason he was the point man in the Nixon administration that called and said, if you go, we'll prosecute you. I said, well, I didn't know State Department officials were making prosecutorial decisions, but I hear you, I'm going. And then I met him here, but he was slumped back in his chair, and it was amazing. And because he's a very articulate Foreign Service career officer, knows everything. And he was reflective. He's not a reflective sort of man. And we came in, and he sat down, and he said, well, I guess the lesson we've learned is that you have to crush these things before they gather force. Speaking of the revolution, what's called the revolution, that you have to crush them before that's a real democratic and humanitarian view of life, before they gain force.
I think one of the most staggering things to me about the revolution and the American attitude to the revolution was the failure of American policymakers to understand just how weak the Shah of Iran was. I'm not talking about weak militarily or weak in the sense of not having a good police force. I'm talking about weak in terms of a character structure. Let me give you an example. So, Jimmy Carter is the president of the United States, and Jimmy Carter thinks that the Shah of Iran is really a tough guy. And so how are we going to deal with this really tough guy? I mean, how do you deal with a guy who's, walking around with these medals, right? How do you deal with a tough guy? Well, the United States has this ambassador in the Philippines. And this ambassador in the Philippines, William Sullivan, he's been dealing with Marcos, and he's been doing a great job, and everybody knows Marcos is really a tough dude. So let's send Sullivan from the Philippines to Tehran because he knows how to handle tough guys. We don't have anybody else who's as good with tough guys. So Sullivan, who doesn't know anything about the Middle East, who doesn't know anything about Iran, and he admits this, he wrote a book, and he says this in his book, didn't know anything about Iran, he had never served in the Middle East, he had always been out there in Asia. He shows up in Tehran. Now, what was the style with which American ambassadors dealt with the Shah? This was the style. American ambassador would go to see the Shah once a week. There was always a fixed time for a meeting. And the Shah would welcome him and the Shah, and they'd chat a little bit of small talk. And then the Shah would say, I have come up with this brilliant plan for the future of my country. We are going to build a superhighway from Tehran to Mashhad all the way across northern Tehran. And it's going to cost us such and such, and it'll take so long to build this, and that's what's going to happen. And the American ambassador would say something like, Your Majesty, this is a brilliant plan. Only you could have thought up this strategy for making your country prosperous. It's going to be great. But I have one slight suggestion. Maybe instead of building the superhighway, you should pave some roads from the villages to the main road so that farmers could get their crops out to market, and that would increase the income of the poor villagers. And the Shah would say, exactly what I was thinking. This was what I was going to do. That's it. And so then the Shah would go out and make some roads from the villages to the main roads. Well, that was the way the Americans tried to influence the Shah's behavior. And everybody understood this was a kind of game. I mean, every American ambassador understood this was kind of a game. Well, I wouldn't say it was a dictation, but they would discuss the Shah's plans, and this would happen once a week, and they would try to shape the Shah's thinking, and the Shah was always looking forward to this because he needed someone whom he by then considered wanted to protect him and keep him in power, you see, because he was our guy. And so he would listen to the American ambassador, whom he assumed was, wiser and had the ear of the President of the United States and was trying to give good advice for Iran. Sullivan comes to Tehran, and he tells us in his book, and he sits down with the Shah for the first interview, and the Shah says, Ambassador Sullivan, this is what I think I'm going to do, and he gives this whole thing. And Ambassador Sullivan looks at him and he says, Your Majesty, you're the Shah. Whatever you think is right, that's what you should do. The Shah was stunned. What do you think the Shah heard when Ambassador Sullivan said, you're the Shah, whatever you want to do is you should do? Sullivan was being honest. He didn't know what the hell to do in Iran because he didn't know anything about Iran. And he figured the Shah's a tough guy. He had been there for a long time. If that's what Shah thought was right, that's what he should do. The Shah didn't hear that. What the Shah heard was, you should do whatever you want to do, meaning the government of the United States doesn't care what you do. We don't give a damn. You do whatever you want to do, meaning we don't care about you anymore. The Shah was devastated.
Well, again, there wasn't, I don't think, a unified U.S. policy. There was divisions. There were people such as Brzezinski who felt that the U.S. had invested so much political interest in the Shah, so the U.S. should continue supporting the Shah. While there were others such as Sullivan and the ambassador who realized the Shah really had no social support in Iran, and the religious leadership was now becoming more important, and he therefore came to the conclusion that U.S. would better actually then begin to negotiate with the opposition. And then you also find people in, I think, Washington divided, some remaining adamantly pro-Shah, some saying, well, you know, that is now no longer feasible, let's reach out. So you even had unofficial American emissaries going to Paris to talk to Khomeini. And Khomeini, being a good politician, actually played into this, because in those periods you find him talking about how dangers of communism, how he would not in any way open the way to the Soviet Union and so on. So that played into the hands of the pro, let's say, Khomeini elements in the United States who could say, well, we can deal with this guy because he may not be as good as the Shah, but he's equally anti-communist, and therefore we don't have much to lose if we do that.
Yeah, I think that's, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the United States was divided on the wisdom of that. You do that, you immediately signal that you're to the Shah that his days are numbered, or you're not supporting him. And there was an element within the Carter administration who didn't want to do that, as we talked about, Brzezinski, etc.
The royal regime collapsed shortly after, on February 11th, when guerrillas and revolutionary people overwhelmed troops loyal to the Shah in armed street fighting.
And Iranians saw the U.S. as having created that in 1953 and having backed it by creating SAVAK, the Shah's secret police force, and in various other ways. Secondly, the Shah was very, very Western-oriented. He really wanted to push Iran in a Westernized direction. And Iran, you know, has a very long, rich history. Islam is an important part of that. Most Iranians are very conservative in their own personal behavior and in their views about things. And increasingly, especially in the 70s when this really occurred extensively, a lot of Iranians got very, very concerned about how westernized Iran was becoming. And it wasn't even necessarily just religious Iranians. Plenty of secularists were very concerned about this as well. You know, why is the Shah pushing us so extensively into the West? You know, when women started wearing miniskirts and American rock music started blaring out of people's cars and this kind of thing, a lot of Iranians got upset, fearing that their Iranian Islamic culture was disintegrating. And it's a very real concern. It's a concern, for example, that many Americans had in the 1960s and 1970s when there was so much cultural liberalization in the U.S. And it's a real concern whether